In this video, I'm going to take you on a short history lesson because that's the easiest way to understand why these principles are so important is by understanding how they came to be in the first place. So here is how the comedy industry has evolved over time. So very early on, we started with vaudeville and we had comedy as more of theater. So this is before there was one person standing there with a microphone telling jokes. Towards the 1920s, we started breaking away as an industry from what is generally considered to be comedy theater. And so this is when people first started telling jokes on stage. So you can imagine when you first start, when you're the first person who's going to go on stage and just tell jokes, the most important thing is that you are effective on stage. And that is the first pillar, the pillar of effectiveness. This pillar is all about getting laughs on stage. And early on in the comedy industry, this is the only thing that was important. It was proving why stand-up comedy should be an industry on its own. There was nothing fancy going on at all. It was just straight up joke telling. And in fact, the comedians of this era, people like Bob Hope, they acted more like a CEO than what a comedian does today, right? A comedian is more of an artist today, but Bob Hope, by the end of his life, he had over 1 million jokes. Now, he did not write most of those jokes. He bought them from other people. But that was considered acceptable at the time because nobody cared about personality yet. All they cared about was, hey, there's this really new, interesting thing called stand-up comedy where they just tell jokes, and the jokes are funny. Let's go and watch. So that is where we started as an industry. And this is what I mean whenever I say the word mechanical, the mechanical style of humor. This is where you are obsessed about joke structure. And the comedians that really love this style, they are focused on the joke structures. They are very focused on the individual words they use. And they have lots and lots of rules for exactly how each joke should be. And so we call it mechanical because they're acting more like a joke dispensing machine rather than an artist. So this style debuted around the 1920s or so, and then by the 1940s, people were starting to really understand all of the joke structures and how it worked. People had a lot of experience telling these styles of jokes. So at this point, pretty much all of the comedians working in that industry, they knew all of the tricks, right? The tricks had been around long enough. So when that happened, we get into this era where we shifted away from the importance of joke structures. Because now, if everybody knows how to use the joke structure, then why should I pay attention to you instead of somebody else? So by the 1940s, everybody knew all the tricks in the book. There really wasn't a whole lot that differentiated different comedians in the same group because they were all relatively good at using these tools. So what did comedians do? They started focusing on uniqueness. And so this is the second pillar of comedy success, the pillar of uniqueness. In the mid-1960s is when people started really developing this idea of being unique. And it's no surprise that after people abandoned just solely being focused on joke structures, it was when people started thinking about uniqueness after a few years of learning how to be both effective and unique at the same time. After a few years, we get the golden age of comedy. And this is the 1970s to 80s, where comedians were absolute rock stars. This is the era with Steve Martin, with Richard Pryor, with George Carlin, all of the biggest names in comedy history. They are almost always somewhere around this era. The golden age of comedy was an explosion of uniqueness. If you watch any stand-up comedian in the 1960s, then you will see a very generic form of comedy that is almost entirely devoid of uniqueness. And what is really interesting is you can go back and you can watch old videos of Richard Pryor and George Carlin, and they were exactly this way as well. There was nothing unique about them before they abandoned the mechanical style of humor. But you can go back and then you can watch later videos and you can say, wow, like this is an entirely different comedian. And that's because they dropped all of the normal tricks everyone was using. They focused on uniqueness. And the audience said, hey, I can have somebody who can tell all the same kind of jokes that we've been hearing for 40 years, or I can have someone who has learned to be funny and unique at the same time. And so, of course, the people that could be both funny and unique were the ones that rose to the top. They were the superstars of that era. But what happened later on is that after this explosion of uniqueness, we got all of these different genres of comedy, and then now we have tons of comedians inside of each genre. So how do you be unique inside of something that is already unique, right? So it becomes really, really difficult to say like, okay, like Steve Martin developed anti-comedy. Anti-comedy was incredibly unique idea at the time. But now we have a lot of anti-comedians. And how do you be very unique inside of the very specific field of anti-comedy? Well, it's incredibly difficult to be so unique that the audience can notice. Obviously, there's going to be small differences between comedians that are in the same genre, but is that difference big enough for the audience to notice and for the audience to care? So what happened towards the end of the golden age of comedy is that there was another shift. There was a shift from focusing on uniqueness to focusing on authenticity. And that is the third pillar of comedy success today, the pillar of authenticity. Now, why authenticity? Why is this so important? Because with all of these different genres of comedy and with the inability to be easily identifiable as unique, then you need to find another way to separate yourself from everybody else, right? And of course, authenticity is a form of uniqueness as well. But instead of saying like, I'm going to be a one-liner who also does, this other strategy, you're saying, I'm going to be a one-liner, but I'm going to be deeply authentic to who I am. And so what happened is the comedians of this era and the comedians that are successful today all have a lot of authenticity to them. So they have all three of these pillars. Pillar number one, you have to be funny on stage, right? It doesn't matter how unique or authentic you are. In stand-up comedy, your number one job is to make people laugh. So that is obviously the most important pillar. But once you have reached a level where you can write jokes that work and you start to understand how to use these writing principles, from there, you need to move on towards this pillar of uniqueness, where you start learning how to be both unique and effective at the same time. And of course, eventually, you get to this point where you're moderately unique and you're also effective, but now you need to go to this next level where you're also incredibly authentic. And then once you have that authenticity, the reason for authenticity being so important, you can connect with the audience on a deeper level. What's really interesting about each of these shifts into different eras of comedy is that each audience in that era thought that they knew what they wanted. But here's the key here. Audiences don't know what they want until they see something they like. Once they see something they like, it no longer matters what they thought was good. So the audiences of the 1940s, they thought that effectiveness was the only important thing, right? They didn't know what they were missing. But once comedians like Sam Kinison and Steve Martin, these maybe Andy Kaufman, comedians that were really, really unique and different, all of a sudden, audience members said, wait a second, I didn't know I was missing that, but now that I know that that exists, that's what I want. And that's exactly what happened in the golden age of comedy. Towards the end of the golden age, audiences once again said, this is the only two things that are important to me. This is, we have effective joke telling and we have comedians that have personality. That's all I want. I'm good. Thanks a lot. Let's just keep going. But then the comedians that really needed to differentiate themselves became more and more authentic. And you can credit people like, actually, as far back as Lenny Bruce, but especially Richard Pryor. Comedians like that were really the ones that got authenticity off the ground. And then as the golden age of comedy started to wane, we had more and more focus on this authenticity because that became the thing that audiences were responding to now. And that continues to this day. Audiences love these three pillars. Now, something about that might change in the future. There might be a fourth pillar. But until that happens, until some groundbreaking comedian shows us what we're missing, these are the three things that audiences care the most about.
Be sure to like and subscribe, and check out a list of free comedy training resources in the description below.